They were supposed to freeze quietly and be forgotten, but an omega stepped into the ravine and broke the pack's rules. 5 wolves were dying, the storm was closing in, and one of them was far more dangerous than he looked. The question wasn't whether she could save them, it was whether saving them would cost her everything. Before the story begins, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I genuinely love seeing how far these stories travel, and I read every single one. And when the story ends, come back and rate it from 0 to 10. Even just a number lets me know this story mattered to you. Alright, let's begin. They called her expendable. So why did 5 lives, one of them a king, depend on her hands? Calissa Draven had learned early that omegas were not meant to be remembered. In the stoneclaw pack, strength was measured by claw and command. Warriors trained in the stone courtyards, their movements sharp and purposeful. Betas managed trade routes and territory disputes. Alphas ruled from the Great Hall, where firelight cast long shadows across walls carved with pack history. Those without rank, the omegas, learned to endure quietly or disappear entirely. Calissa lived in a half-collapsed shed beyond the main stone hall, where the wind whistled through gaps in the timber and frost crept across the floor each night. Her threadbare cloak, patched so many times the original fabric was barely visible, hung from a rusted nail. Her fingers bore the permanent marks of frostbite, white scars across knuckles that no longer felt the full bite of cold. She survived by making herself useful in ways no one else would. Repairing broken tools discarded by the forge. Hauling firewood through knee-deep snow when the younger pack members refused. Scavenging abandoned equipment from failed hunting expeditions. Salvaging what could be reused. It was work beneath even the lowest-ranked warriors. But it kept her fed, barely, and it kept her alive. The rigid hierarchy of stoneclaw was not merely tradition, it was doctrine. Alphas led because strength demanded respect. Betas served because competence earned position. Omegas existed because every system required someone to bear its weight. The elders spoke of balance, of natural order, of each wolf knowing their place. What they never spoke of was how easily place became burden, and how conveniently burdens could be discarded. On the morning of the White Sundering's 3rd week, Calissa knelt in the snow outside the tool shed, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air as she hammered a bent axle straight. The metal rang with each strike, a lonely sound against the vast silence of winter. Elder Morvaine's shadow fell across her work. "Omega," he said, his voice carrying the particular tone reserved for those deemed beneath notice. A supply cart was abandoned near the northern ice ravines during the last storm. "You will retrieve it." Calissa looked up, squinting against the pale morning light. The northern ravines were 3 hours into the frozen waste, where the wind carved ice into blade-sharp formations and temperatures dropped so low that breath froze before it left the lungs. "Alone, Elder?" she asked quietly. "The warriors are needed elsewhere." Morvaine's expression revealed nothing. "You leave within the hour." He turned and walked away before she could respond, his boots crunching through snow that would be knee-deep on her, but barely reached his shins. Calissa set down her hammer and stared at the northern horizon, where gray clouds gathered like predators. Around her, pack life continued. Warriors sparring, children playing, smoke rising from warm hearths. No one met her eyes. No one offered supplies. No one questioned the order. They did not need to. Everyone understood what this mission truly was: a disposal disguised as duty. Hierarchical systems justified such cruelty easily, by labeling people as burdens first, then treating them as less than wolves. The pack could eliminate its unwanted without blood on anyone's hands. Calissa gathered her threadbare cloak, a half-empty water skin, and a knife too dull to be useful for anything but cutting rope. She did not say goodbye. There was no one to say it to. As she stepped beyond Stoneclaw's borders into the frozen waste, the wind immediately tearing at her clothes, Calissa knew a simple truth: No one expected her return. But something in her, something her mother had passed down before hunger took her, refused to accept that this was how her story ended. The wind was a living thing. It did not simply blow, it hunted. It found every gap in Calissa's threadbare cloak, every exposed inch of skin, every vulnerability her body offered. The cold followed behind it like a patient predator, waiting for exhaustion to do what the elements alone could not. Calissa had been walking for 2 hours when water began seeping into her left boot. The leather had finally given way, splitting along a seam she had patched 3 times already. Ice water crept between her toes with each step, drawing heat from her foot in a steady, relentless strain. She did not panic. Panic burned energy faster than running, and she had precious little of either to spare. Instead, she stopped. She wrapped strips of cloth torn from the inner lining of her cloak around her foot, creating a barrier between skin and sodden leather. It would not last long, but it would buy her time. In the frozen waste, time was the only currency that mattered. Her mother's voice echoed in memory. Cold does not kill first, Calissa. Panic does. Then comes exhaustion. Then exposure. If you control the first, you can delay the rest. Calissa resumed walking, her pace measured and deliberate. She breathed through her nose, warming the air before it reached her lungs. She kept her hands tucked beneath her arms when not in use, preserving circulation. She rationed her movements, understanding that every unnecessary action was a tax on her dwindling reserves of body heat. The landscape transformed as she moved deeper into the white sundering's grip. Snowfields stretched endlessly, their surfaces creaking beneath her weight, a sound like bones settling. Ice cliffs rose on either side of the narrow path, their faces carved by wind into shapes that seemed almost deliberate. Frozen waterfalls hung suspended in time, blue-white and jagged as broken glass. Above, the sky pressed down, gray and oppressive. No sun penetrated the clouds. No warmth reached the earth. Calissa's fingers had stopped hurting an hour ago. She knew what that meant. The cold had moved past pain into numbness, the body's final defense before tissue began to die. She flexed them periodically, forcing blood back into the extremities, fighting against the lethargy that whispered for her to rest, to stop, to sleep. Sleep in the white sundering was another word for death. The educational reality of hypothermia was brutally simple. The body prioritized its core, sacrificing fingers and toes first, then limbs, then consciousness. The process was methodical, inevitable, and terrifyingly quiet. Most people who froze to death did, so believing they were finally warm. Calissa would not let that happen. Not today. The ravine appeared without warning. One moment she was trudging through relatively level snow. The next, the ground dropped away into a wound carved deep into the frozen earth. Ice spires rose from the ravine floor like the teeth of some ancient beast, their surfaces catching what little light penetrated the storm clouds. The walls were sheer, carved smooth by wind and time. And there, half buried in snow near the center, was the broken supply cart. Calissa's heart sank. Getting down into the ravine would be dangerous. Getting back out might be impossible. She was calculating her approach, searching for handholds in the ice wall, when she heard it. A sound that did not belong to the wind. Low, uneven, rhythmic, breathing. Calissa's hand went to the dull knife at her belt. She crept forward, boots crunching softly in fresh snow, and peered over the edge into the ravine's heart. 5 shapes lay motionless between the ice spires, their dark forms dusted with white. Not shapes. Wolves. Calissa's breath caught in her throat. They were not wild wolves. The size alone told her that these were shifters, pack members trapped in wolf form. One was massive, his dark coat nearly black beneath the frost that clung to every hair. He lay at the center, his chest rising and falling in shallow, labored breaths. Ice had formed around his muzzle, and his eyes were closed. The other 4 were smaller but no less dire. 2 gray wolves curled together, their bodies rigid with cold. A tawny wolf with a gash across its shoulder lay on its side, breath coming in uneven gasps. The 5th, russet-furred, had its paw trapped beneath a fallen ice shard. They were dying. Calissa's mind screamed at her to leave, to climb back up, retrieve the cart if possible, and return to Stoneclaw. Helping them would take hours she did not have. The storm was building again. She could feel it in the pressure of the air, see it in the darkening clouds. If she stayed, she would die here with them. But her mother's voice rose again, stronger this time. We do not abandon our own, even when our own have abandoned us. These wolves were Stoneclaw, elite scouts, perhaps, sent to survey the ravines before the white sundering trapped them. They had families waiting, roles to fill. They mattered to the pack in ways Calissa never would. And yet, that was not why she moved. She descended into the ravine, using ice spires as handholds, her boots slipping twice before she reached the bottom. The cold here was worse, trapped, concentrated, sharp enough to steal breath. Calissa knelt beside the nearest wolf, the russet one with the trapped paw. She examined the ice shard carefully. Pulling it free too quickly could cause further injury, but leaving it meant inevitable frostbite. Frostbite progressed in stages. Frostnip turned skin pale and numb. Superficial frostbite created blisters, and deep frostbite destroyed tissue entirely. The wolf's paw had reached the 2nd stage. She could see the grayish tint beneath the fur. She used her knife to carefully chip away ice around the shard, then braced the wolf's leg and lifted the ice fragment clear. The wolf whimpered, but did not snap. Moving to the next wolf, Calissa cleared frost from muzzles first, blocked airways killed faster than cold. She massaged frozen limbs with firm, circular motions, forcing blood back toward extremities. Her mother had taught her this with livestock during harsh winters. Gentle pressure, consistent rhythm, never rubbing directly, as that damaged already compromised tissue. The tawny wolf with the shoulder wound needed the most care. Calissa packed snow against the gash to slow bleeding, then wrapped it with the last clean strip from her cloak's lining. Finally, she approached the massive dark wolf. His fur was thick, built for cold, but even he could not withstand this. Calissa knelt and carefully cleared ice from his face, then pressed her palm against his chest. His heartbeat was slow but steady. As she worked, the wolf's eyes began to open. Not with aggression, not with fear. They watched her with something else entirely, an intelligence that made her breath catch. These were not merely animals. They were witnesses. And they were seeing an Omega risk everything for those who had never risked anything for her. The dark wolf's amber eyes locked onto hers, and Calissa understood. Whatever happened next, nothing would be the same. Calissa forced herself to look away from those watching eyes. Sentiment would not keep them alive. Action would. The broken supply cart lay half-buried 15 paces away. She trudged through knee-deep snow to examine it, her numbed fingers assessing damage by touch as much as sight. The main axle had snapped clean through, but the frame remained intact. Canvas that had once covered supplies hung torn but usable. Wooden planks, meant to reinforce the bed, had scattered across the ice. She had built with less. Working quickly, Calissa dragged the cart's frame toward the largest ice spire, positioning it to create a windbreak. The educational principle was simple but vital. Wind chill could drop effective temperatures by 30 degrees or more. Blocking the wind was as critical as generating heat. She wedged the broken axle between 2 ice formations, creating a support beam, then leaned the planks against it at an angle. The structure was crude but functional, a lean-to that would trap what little warmth their bodies generated. She stretched the torn canvas across the top and secured it with chunks of ice, creating a barrier against the snow beginning to fall again. The shelter was barely large enough for all 6 of them. That was the point. Calissa returned to the wolves, speaking softly as she approached. "I need to move you. I'll be gentle." She did not know if they understood words, but tone mattered. Calm was contagious. So was panic. She started with the smallest wolves, dragging them carefully across the ice into the shelter. Their weight was substantial even in their weakened state, each one easily twice her mass. Her muscles screamed. Her wet boots squelched with every step. She ignored both. Once all 5 wolves were inside, Calissa arranged them strategically. The 2 gray wolves she positioned on the outside edges. Their thick fur would insulate the group. The injured tawny wolf went in the center, where warmth would concentrate. The russet wolf with the damaged paw she placed near the entrance where she could monitor it. The massive dark wolf she left in the deepest part of the shelter, his bulk generating the most core heat. Then came the hardest part. Calissa crawled into the remaining space, pressing herself between the wolves. Every instinct screamed that this was madness. Wolves were predators, and she was prey. But heat transfer required contact. Survival required trust. The wolves shifted, and she tensed. But they did not attack. Instead, they moved closer, adjusting their positions to accommodate her presence. The russet wolf draped its tail across her legs. One of the gray wolves rested its head near her shoulder. The dark wolf's steady breathing warmed the air near her face. They were accepting her into their circle. Calissa began rotating their positions every hour, moving those on the edges toward the center, ensuring no single wolf bore the brunt of cold exposure for too long. This was knowledge passed down from her mother, who had learned it from her grandmother, how herders kept livestock alive during brutal winters. Shared warmth, constant rotation, vigilant care. The wolves cooperated without resistance, as if recognizing the logic behind her actions. Outside, the storm intensified. Wind howled through the ravine like a living thing denied its prey. Snow accumulated against the canvas roof, actually improving insulation. Inside the shelter, breath fogged in the cramped space, but the temperature held, not warm, but survivable. Calissa pressed her frost-damaged hands against the dark wolf's side, borrowing his warmth. Her eyes grew heavy. Exhaustion pulled at her consciousness with irresistible weight. The storm clouds thickened overhead, blotting out what little light remained. Night descended over the white sundering like a final judgment. And in the shelter of broken things, 6 hearts beat against the dark. None of them guaranteed to see dawn. The dark wolf had been awake for hours. Silarath Valorian lay motionless in the deepest part of the shelter, his body still recovering from the cold that had nearly claimed him. His warriors, elite scouts he had personally selected for the Northern Survey, breathed steadily around him. Alive, when they should have been corpses frozen to the ice. Because of her, through half-lidded eyes, he watched the Omega work. She moved with quiet efficiency despite obvious exhaustion, checking each wolf in turn, adjusting positions to maximize heat distribution, pressing snow against the tawny wolf's wound when fresh blood seeped through the makeshift bandage. She did not command. She served. And in serving, she led. Silarath recognized the technique she employed: rotation to prevent exposure, strategic positioning based on body mass and fur density, constant monitoring for signs of deterioration. These were practices from the old ways, before Stoneclaw had grown obsessed with hierarchy and dominance, before knowledge had been replaced by rank. His grandmother had spoken of such things, in the years before she died. She had called it Valoran Kesht, the shepherd's wisdom. Not the strength to dominate, but the awareness to sustain. The ability to see what was needed before it became critical. The Stoneclaw elders had dismissed such concepts as weakness. Alpha authority came from force, they insisted, not from this. Yet here, in a frozen ravine where force meant nothing, this nameless Omega had accomplished what his strength could not. She had kept 5 warriors alive through knowledge, patience, and a willingness to sacrifice her own diminishing reserves. Silarath watched as she rotated Melda, the russet scout with the injured paw, toward the center. Melda's eyes flickered open, and for a moment the wolf tensed, a warrior's instinct against vulnerability. But the Omega's hands were gentle, her voice a low murmur that carried no threat. Melda relaxed, shifted closer to the warmth. Trusted. That trust should not exist. Omegas were meant to obey, not lead. They were labor, not authority. The pack structure was clear, established, immutable. And yet his warriors, wolves who answered only to direct commands from rank superiors, were following her guidance without question. Not because she demanded it, but because her actions demonstrated competence. Truth. Care. Leadership without authority. Service without subservience. The concepts should have been contradictory. But watching her work, Silarath understood they never had been. Stoneclaw had simply forgotten the difference. He thought of the council meeting 3 weeks ago, when Elder Morvain had discussed resource allocation and burden reduction. The clinical language had obscured the reality. They were systematically eliminating Omegas through neglect and impossible tasks. He had said nothing. Had assumed the elders understood pack management better than he did. Had trusted that their decisions served Stoneclaw's greater good. Watching this Omega fight for 5 lives that mattered more to the pack than hers ever would, Silarath felt something cold settle in his chest that had nothing to do with the weather. Shame. The Omega suddenly tensed, her head turning toward the shelter entrance. Silarath's ears pricked forward, catching what she had sensed. Silence. The wind had stopped. The storm's howling had ceased. In the frozen waste, sudden silence was never a good sign. The Omega crawled carefully to the entrance and peered out into the darkness. Her body went rigid. Silarath shifted slightly, enough to see past her. Fresh tracks marked the snow beyond the ravine. Large. Deliberate. Multiple sets. Not wildlife. Wolves. And they were circling. Calissa counted the tracks. 7 distinct sets, maybe 8, difficult to tell where the patterns overlapped. The gait was wrong for Stoneclaw patrols. These wolves moved with the deliberate spacing of hunters, not scouts. Ice hunters. Rival pack members who claimed the northern territories beyond Stoneclaw's borders. They survived by scavenging what the White Sundering left behind, and by claiming any weakness they discovered. The 5 injured Stoneclaw wolves would be exactly that. Weakness. Territory to claim. Rivals to eliminate. Behind her, she heard movement. The dark wolf had risen to his feet, swaying slightly but alert. The others stirred, recognizing threat even in their compromised state. They would fight, she realized. Even wounded, even frozen, they would defend themselves. They would also die. Calissa's mind raced. She had no weapons beyond her dull knife. The wolves could barely stand. Running was impossible. The ice hunters controlled the high ground, and her group would be exposed the moment they left the ravine. But she had terrain. She had knowledge. And she had something the ice hunters would not expect. Stay, she whispered, pressing her hand against the dark wolf's shoulder. His amber eyes met hers, and she saw comprehension. Trust me. She moved quickly. Using her knife, she carved chunks from the ice spires nearest the ravine entrance, creating a bottleneck. Only 1 or 2 wolves could enter at a time. Territorial psychology dictated that predators preferred overwhelming advantage. Force them into confined space, and their numbers became a liability rather than strength. Next, she gathered the driest scraps of canvas and wood splinters from the cart. Fire was dangerous in enclosed spaces, but controlled flame created a psychological barrier. Animals avoided fire instinctively. She positioned the Stoneclaw wolves strategically. The 2 gray wolves at the bottleneck where their combined mass could hold position, the russet and tawny wolves in secondary support despite their injuries, and the massive dark wolf at the rear, both as final defense and because he could barely stand. "When they come," she said quietly, "you move as one unit, not as 5 fighters.
1.
You guard each other's flanks. You rotate when one tires. You defend as pack, not as individuals." Cooperative defense was a principle abandoned by most warrior cultures in favor of individual glory. But pack animals survived through collective action, each member protecting the whole protecting each member. Wolves knew this instinctively. They had simply forgotten to apply it. The ice hunters appeared at the ravine's edge. 8 of them, lean and scarred, eyes reflecting what little light remained. Their leader, a wolf with gray-streaked fur, snarled down at them. Calissa struck flint against her knife, and sparks caught the canvas scraps. Small flames flickered to life at the bottleneck entrance. The ice hunters hesitated. That hesitation was all she needed. The gray stoneclaw wolves surged forward as one, filling the narrow opening. When the lead ice hunter lunged, they moved in perfect synchronization, one blocking, one striking, then rotating positions before exhaustion could take hold. The russet wolf, despite his injured paw, covered the gray wolf's exposed side. The tawny wolf, wound reopening, held the opposite flank. Not 5 separate fighters. One unified defense. The ice hunters, expecting easy prey, found coordinated resistance. They retreated, regrouped, tested different angles. Each time, the stoneclaw wolf shifted as a single organism, Calissa calling adjustments from the rear. The storm chose that moment to reach its peak. Wind exploded through the ravine with renewed fury, and snow fell so thick it became a solid wall of white. The ice hunters vanished into the blizzard. Calissa tried to call out, to check the wolves, but her voice wouldn't come. Her legs buckled. The last thing she felt was the dark wolf catching her before she hit the frozen ground. The blizzard howled with the fury of something alive and vindictive. Calissa drifted through consciousness like debris caught in a current. She felt warmth pressing against her back, her sides, surrounding her completely. Fur, bodies, breath that fogged the air near her face. The wolves had closed ranks around her, their bodies forming a living shield against the storm. When the wind shifted, they shifted with it, always maintaining the barrier between her fragile human form and the elements that sought to claim her. In her delirium, she heard her mother's voice. In the coldest dark, trust becomes warmth. Survival is never solitary. The educational truth was simple. Extreme environments demanded mutual dependence. No individual, regardless of strength, could survive prolonged exposure alone. Shared body heat, coordinated effort, collective vigilance, these were the pillars upon which survival was built. The wolves understood this instinctively. They had simply needed someone to remind them. Hours blurred together. Calissa felt the russet wolf press closer when her shivering intensified. Felt the gray wolves rotate positions, ensuring fresh warmth reached her core. Felt the massive dark wolf's steady heartbeat against her spine, an anchor in the chaos. They should have died. All of them. But dawn came anyway. The silence woke her. Not the absence of wind. True silence, where even breath seemed suspended. Calissa's eyes fluttered open to pale morning light filtering through gaps in the canvas shelter. The wolves were still, watching. Then the dark wolf moved. His form shimmered, bones restructuring with sounds that should have been painful but seemed fluid, practiced. Black fur receded into bronze skin. Massive limbs refined into human proportions. Within moments, a man knelt where the wolf had been, broad-shouldered, scarred, with amber eyes that held the same intelligence she had recognized in the beast. He was naked in the freezing air but seemed not to notice. His gaze locked onto hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You were sent here to die," he said quietly. It was not a question. Calissa tried to sit up, failed, and the man, no, the alpha, she realized with sudden, terrible clarity, steadied her with one hand. "I know," she whispered. Silarath Valorian, missing alpha of the Stoneclaw pack, knelt in the snow before an Omega who had saved his life. And for the first time in the White Sundering's long, brutal weeks, something shifted in the frozen air, something that felt almost like hope. The great stone hall fell silent when Silarath Valorian walked through its doors. Warriors dropped to one knee. Betas froze mid-conversation. Children stared with wide eyes at the alpha they had mourned as dead. Behind him walked his 4 scouts, battered, limping, but alive. And behind them, barely standing, came Calissa Draven. Elder Morvaine's face drained of color. "Alpha," he managed, voice trembling. "We thought the storm." "You thought correctly," Silarath said, his tone carrying the weight of absolute authority. "The storm should have killed us. It nearly did." He turned, extending his hand toward Calissa. "This Omega prevented that outcome." Murmurs rippled through the assembled pack. Omegas did not receive recognition. They certainly did not stand beside Alphas in formal address. "She was sent to retrieve a cart," Morvaine said carefully. "We are pleased she succeeded in more. She was sent to die." Silarath's words cut through the hall like a blade through snow.
"No escort. No supplies."
No expectation of return. You ordered her into the White Sundering alone, knowing it was a death sentence. The Elder's jaw tightened. The pack has limited resources. "The first laws of Stoneclaw," Silarath interrupted, his voice rising, "written by our founders 3 centuries ago, state explicitly, no wolf shall be condemned without trial. No wolf shall be abandoned without cause. No wolf shall be deemed expendable by rank alone." He pulled a worn leather tome from his pack, the original law codes, preserved in the Alpha's den. Every pack member learned their contents as children. Few remembered them as adults. "You violated our founding principles," Silarath continued. "Not through passion or error, but through calculated cruelty disguised as efficiency. You created a system that erased the vulnerable by simply not counting them." The educational reality was stark. Throughout history, societies had perpetuated injustice not through dramatic evil, but through bureaucratic erasure. When those in power stopped seeing certain people as people, atrocity became policy. Law existed to prevent this. When those who enforced it chose power over principle, the entire system corrupted. "She's Omega," Morvaine said, desperation creeping into his voice. "The hierarchy exists to serve the pack's survival," Silarath finished, "not to justify murder." He turned to face the assembled wolves. "This Omega demonstrated more leadership, more knowledge, more strength than our entire Elder Council. She saved 5 lives you wrote off as acceptable losses. She honored our laws when you betrayed them." Silence stretched. Then Silarath spoke the words that would reshape Stoneclaw. "The pack must now choose. Do we define strength by dominance and rank? Or by responsibility, knowledge, and the courage to act when action costs everything?" The stone hall waited. And in that waiting, the future hung suspended, fragile as dawn after the longest night. Melda, the russet scout whose paw Calissa had freed from the ice, was the first to speak. "Responsibility," he said simply, and knelt before her. One by one, the other scouts followed. Then warriors. Then betas who had watched Omegas suffer in silence. Within moments, half the hall had knelt, not in submission, but in recognition. Elder Morvaine stood alone, his face twisted with disbelief. "You would overturn centuries of order for justice," Silarath said quietly, "which was always the foundation of our order. You simply forgot." The judgment came swiftly. The elders who had systematically condemned Omegas were stripped of authority. Not executed. Stoneclaw did not trade one cruelty for another, but removed from positions where their erasure could become policy. They would live as they had forced others to live, without rank, without privilege, surviving by their own hands. Omega protections were reinstated from the ancient codes. No wolf could be sent on missions alone without cause. Resources would be distributed by need, not status. Knowledge, especially survival knowledge, would be valued as highly as combat prowess. Silarath turned to Kalissa. The pack owes you a debt. Name your status, and it will be granted. She looked at him for a long moment, then around the hall at faces that had once refused to see her. I am Kalissa Draven, she said quietly. I claim no rank but this, teacher. Someone must ensure the old knowledge, the survival wisdom, the cooperative practices, the understanding that we endure together or not at all, is never forgotten again. Silarath smiled. Then Stoneclaw has gained its most valuable member. In the weeks that followed, the pack transformed. Survival training incorporated the techniques Kalissa had used in the ravine: heat conservation, resource management, cooperative defense. Young wolves learned that strength came not from dominance alone, but from the wisdom to know when to lead, when to serve, and when to simply endure. Silarath reshaped leadership philosophy around a simple principle: those who could not see the value in every pack member did not deserve to lead any of them. The educational truth embedded itself into Stoneclaw's culture. Societies survived not by elevating the powerful, but by valuing every role. Strength without compassion collapsed under its own weight. True resilience grew from recognizing that the most vulnerable often held the knowledge that saved everyone. On the first anniversary of the White Sundering, the pack gathered in the Great Hall. Kalissa stood at the center of the stone circle, no longer outside looking in, but surrounded by those who had learned to see her. Stoneclaw would remember the winter that nearly destroyed them. They would remember the Alpha, who learned humility. They would remember the Scouts who survived through unity. But most of all, they would remember the Omega who taught them how to live. If you stayed until the end, thank you. That means you didn't look away when someone without power carried the weight of everyone else's survival. This channel tells stories about people the world is quick to discard, and honestly, it only survives if people like you decide it's worth standing behind. If you haven't subscribed yet, don't let this story end here. Help us keep telling stories that remind the world no one is expendable. Subscribe, not for me but for every voice that almost freezes into silence.